What if the most powerful move in a war was to never fire a single bullet? What if the most strategically brilliant nation on the planet right now is not the one launching missiles, not the one issuing threats, not the one flexing its aircraft carriers in open water, but a country that has quietly, patiently, almost invisibly positioned itself at the very center of a conflict that officially it wants nothing to do with? What if, while the world's greatest powers are bleeding treasure and credibility, one nation is sitting at the table that every other nation desperately wants access to? The name of that nation is India. And before you dismiss that, before you scroll past, before you say, that sounds like propaganda, just stay with me for a moment. This is not a story about India being powerful in the traditional sense. India is not dropping bombs. India is not sending warships into enemy territory. India is not posturing at the United Nations with vetoes and threats. This is a story about something far more rare, far more difficult, and far more consequential than raw military power. This is a story about wisdom. And right now, in the middle of a war that is reshaping the entire global energy order, wisdom may be the only currency that actually matters. To understand what India has done, you first have to understand the speed at which this world came apart. Go back to February 28, 2026. Pre-dawn. The sky over Iran was still dark. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran under an operation given the name Epic Fury. And the name was not an exaggeration. In a matter of hours, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic with an iron hand for 37 years, was dead. His daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchild, 7 of Iran's most senior security commanders. Gone. Not over weeks, not over months, in a single morning. Think about what that means. A government that had survived revolutions, sanctions, proxy wars, assassination attempts, and international isolation for nearly 4 decades was decapitated in the time it takes the rest of the world to have breakfast. The world held its breath. Iran did not crumble. Iran did not beg. Iran responded. Within hours, Iranian missiles were striking American military installations in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Qatar. Iranian drones began crossing the Gulf, targeting infrastructure across multiple countries simultaneously. And then came the announcement that sent shock waves through every trading floor, every energy ministry, every government war room on the planet. The Strait of Hormuz, that narrow, irreplaceable corridor of water through which 1/5 of the entire world's oil supply flows every single day, was closed. Not symbolically closed, actually closed. Tanker traffic dropped 70% within 48 hours. Then it dropped to almost nothing. Brent crude jumped 8% in a single trading session. Then it kept going, past $80, past $90, past $100 a barrel for the first time in years, and still climbing. The International Energy Agency made an emergency declaration announcing the largest release of strategic reserves in the organization's entire history. 400 million barrels pushed into global markets in a desperate attempt to calm prices. It barely scratched the surface. The price kept rising. The world was staring at an energy catastrophe, and there was no clear exit. But this was not the only front threatening to destabilize everything. On India's northwest border, Pakistan had launched a full military campaign against the Taliban-controlled territories of Afghanistan. Strikes on Kabul, troops mobilizing across a frontier that has always been a powder keg. A two-front security crisis was now threatening to turn the entire northwestern subcontinent into a region of open, unpredictable conflict. And then, just when it seemed impossible for the situation to become more complicated, something happened in waters that India considers its own backyard. A United States submarine torpedoed an Iranian warship. Not in the Persian Gulf, not in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Indian Ocean, just off the coast of Sri Lanka. The vessel that was sunk, the Iris Dina, had just days earlier completed a naval exercise hosted by India itself. India had been the gracious host. India had welcomed these sailors, and now those same sailors were in the water. Here is where the story of India truly begins. On the same day that the Iris Dana went to the bottom of the Indian Ocean, the same day, another Iranian warship sailing urgently southward reached the port of Kochi on India's southwestern coast and requested permission to dock. Tehran sent an emergency message to New Delhi. The Iranian government, reeling from the greatest military catastrophe it had faced in decades, was asking India for shelter. India said yes, not after days of deliberation, not after consulting with Washington, not after carefully polling the international mood. India said yes, and India's External Affairs Minister, Jaishankar, stood up in Parliament and told the nation, told the world, that it was, and I want to be precise here, the right thing to do. 183 Iranian sailors, many of them barely grown, barely out of their training academies, were brought ashore at Indian naval facilities. India arranged accommodation. India arranged medical attention. India arranged flights home for those who didn't need to remain. And India picked up the phone and called Tehran. Not once, not twice, but 4 separate times at the foreign minister level since the war began. Think about the geometry of that moment. An American submarine had just destroyed an Iranian warship in India's neighborhood. And India, rather than distancing itself from the conflict, rather than issuing a careful diplomatic statement about condemning all acts of aggression, rather than staying neutral in the most antiseptic way possible, India opened its ports, opened its arms, and told the survivors that they were safe. Washington said nothing publicly. Tehran called India a friend. And somewhere in the corridors of power in New Delhi, someone smiled quietly. Because this was not an impulsive act of compassion, beautiful as that compassion was. This was policy. This was calculated, deliberate, and brilliant. Now let me tell you about 2 ships. Their names are the Shivalik and the Nandanda Devi. Both of them fly the Indian flag. Both of them are gas carriers, vessels designed to move liquefied petroleum and natural gas across the seas that connect producers to consumers. On the night of March 13, 2026, while oil markets were in free fall and governments around the world were rationing energy reserves, while every NATO-aligned tanker sat frozen in place and no American-escorted vessel dared attempt the passage, the Shivalik entered the Strait of Hormuz, alone. No United States Navy escort, no NATO protection, no insurance company on Earth willing to write a policy on that risk. Just an Indian flag vessel moving through a waterway that Iran's Revolutionary Guard had effectively turned into a militarized choke point. It made it through. Hours later, the Nandanda Devi followed. Iran's ambassador to India publicly confirmed what had happened and explained why. India, he said, was being given what he called a safe corridor. The 2 nations, in his words, share a common fate. Pause on that phrase. A common fate. The Iranian government, which had just lost its supreme leader, which was under sustained military attack from the most powerful forces in the world, which had closed the most strategically vital waterway on the planet to everyone else, was keeping a door open. One door for one country, India. Not the European Union, with all its trade agreements. Not Japan, desperately dependent on Gulf oil. Not South Korea. Not Australia. Not any of the dozens of nations whose economies were beginning to buckle under soaring energy costs. India. And over 20 Indian flag vessels were still stranded in and around the Gulf, but these 2 ships had proven something extraordinary. India had a safe passage when nobody else did. India had leverage that no other nation possessed. To understand how India ended up in this position, you need to go back 20 years, maybe further. Because what is unfolding right now did not happen by accident. It did not happen because India got lucky. It happened because India made choices, patient, often painful, frequently misunderstood choices, that the rest of the world dismissed as inconsistency or weakness or diplomatic confusion. The concept at the heart of India's foreign policy for the better part of 2 decades is called strategic autonomy. The idea is deceptively simple. In a world that constantly demands you choose sides, you're either with the West or against it, either with Russia or with NATO, either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, India decided deliberately, stubbornly, almost defiantly, to refuse. India purchased Russian-made S-400 missile defense systems and faced enormous pressure from Washington, threats of sanctions, diplomatic cold shoulders. India kept buying. India deepened its defense partnership with Israel, buying weapons, sharing intelligence, cooperating on technology, While simultaneously maintaining the Chabahar Port Agreement with Iran, India's carefully constructed gateway to Central Asia and Afghanistan that bypasses Pakistan entirely. India reduced its imports of Russian oil when Washington pressed hard enough during earlier conflicts, absorbing the economic pain of narrowing its own options. And then, when this war exploded and global energy prices shattered every previous ceiling, Washington quietly came to New Delhi and made a remarkable request. Please, the Americans said, buy Russian oil again. Prices are destroying our allies. We need you to stabilize the market. And India, which had paid a genuine strategic price to comply with American pressure just months earlier, India was handed without conditions, without demands, a geopolitical gift. A special waiver to resume Russian oil imports at a moment when every other major consumer in the world was scrambling for alternatives. Not because Washington suddenly loves India more than its NATO allies, not out of sentiment or friendship, but because India had spent 2 decades building relationships that made it uniquely, irreplaceably useful. Iran trusts India because India sheltered Iranian sailors and has never publicly condemned the Islamic Republic in the terms that Washington demands of its close allies. Washington trusts India because India is one of the most credible counterweights to Chinese expansion in Asia, and because India has a rare combination of reach, restraint, and reliability. And Tehran, now facing a war that has decapitated its leadership and isolated it from almost every major power, is turning to India, the current chair of BRICS, and asking it to play a stabilizing role in whatever comes next. Every major player in this conflict is coming to India with something to offer. Every major player needs India for something. That is what strategic autonomy actually looks like when it works. Not as a slogan, not as a line in an academic paper or a diplomatic speech, but as a living, breathing reality on the most explosive stage in the world. But here is where honesty demands that we stop celebrating for a moment. Because India is not just winning right now, India is also in genuine, frightening danger. And the danger is arithmetic. India imports nearly 90% of all the crude oil it consumes. Think about that number. 9 out of every 10 barrels of oil that powers India's factories, fuels India's cars, cooks India's food, heats India's homes. 9 out of 10 of those barrels comes from somewhere else, carried across seas that India does not control. Close to half of those imports flow through the Strait of Hormuz, the same strait that Iran has now effectively closed to the rest of the world. India's strategic petroleum reserve, the emergency stockpile of oil that the country has set aside for exactly this kind of crisis, lasts approximately 20 to 25 days, 3 weeks. That is the buffer between a functional economy and a crisis. The Shivalik made it through. The Nandanda Devi made it through. But more than 20 other Indian-flagged vessels were still stranded when these crossings happened. And across Indian states, reports were already emerging of cooking gas shortages. LPG prices were climbing. Ordinary families, people who had nothing to do with geopolitics or diplomacy or great power competition, were starting to feel the pinch at their kitchen stoves. Now consider what happens if oil prices reach $150 a barrel, a figure that Iran has itself threatened as a possibility. Financial analysts who have run the calculations are arriving at a number that is almost too large to absorb. India's annual oil import bill could increase by $75 to $100 billion in a single year. That is not an uncomfortable statistic. That is an economy-breaking catastrophe. That is double-digit inflation ripping through a population where millions of families live on carefully managed margins. That is the Reserve Bank of India forced to raise interest rates sharply, choking credit and slowing growth. That is years of hard-won economic momentum evaporating. And there is another loss that rarely gets mentioned in the breathless coverage of diplomatic maneuvering: the Chabahar port. India spent years and enormous resources building this project. Chabahar is a port in southeastern Iran, on the Gulf of Oman. For India, it was never just a port. It was a strategic masterpiece, a way to reach Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the broader Eurasian marketplace without setting foot on Pakistani soil. In a region where Pakistan has consistently tried to deny India access and influence, Chabahar was India's answer. India's counter-move on the geopolitical chessboard. The United States had already been tightening sanctions on projects related to Iran before this war began. Now, with the war actively ongoing and India formally categorized by Washington as a special strategic partner, the Chabahar project's future is genuinely uncertain. Every day of this conflict increases the risk that the project gets frozen, sanctioned, or simply rendered impossible by the chaos around it. And if India loses Chabahar, the consequences reach far beyond trade. China is waiting. Beijing has long wanted to absorb Chabahar into its belt and road architecture. One of India's most carefully built strategic advantages could slip away, not because India failed, but because a war it never started destroyed the environment that made it possible. On March 12, 2026, a television broadcast in Iran carried a message from the man who now leads the Islamic Republic, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son, the inheritor, the young man who woke up to find his father dead and himself suddenly in possession of the most dangerous and most isolated leadership position on earth. He did not appear on camera. There was no video, no audio. A news anchor read his statement while a photograph was displayed on screen. Nobody in the intelligence agencies of the world, not the CIA, not Mossad, not MI6, knows for certain whether he is injured. Nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows the true condition of the leadership structure around him. What his statement said, however, was unambiguous. The Strait of Hormuz will remain closed. American military bases in the region will continue to face attacks, and Iran is expected to retaliate for its losses. Oil prices surged within minutes of that announcement. This matters because it highlights how difficult India's position has become. The older Khamenei was shaped by revolution, war, and decades of sanctions. He was calculated and understood the costs of escalation. His son is different. He has just seen his family and much of Iran's leadership wiped out, and now leads a country with millions displaced, a weakened military, and damaged oil infrastructure. He is younger, angrier, and driven more by grief and rage than any recent Iranian leader. This is the leader India must deal with, one it's trying to maintain ties with and even mediate for. But a single misstep by India could shut the door entirely. As a result, New Delhi's outreach to Tehran is becoming more strained. Let me step away from the diplomacy for a moment. Let me step away from the strategic calculus in the oil prices and the port projects and the waiver letters. Let me talk about people. 10 million Indian citizens live and work across the Gulf region. They are in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Kuwait, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Oman. They came looking for opportunity, and in many cases they found it. They work construction sites in temperatures that would hospitalize most people. They staff hospitals and hotels and retail stores and logistics companies. They drive taxis and clean buildings and care for elderly people and raise families. Every month, they send money home. The total flow of those remittances, the billions of rupees sent from Gulf bank accounts to families in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Andhra Pradesh, in Uttar Pradesh, in Bihar, dwarfs India's trade with Israel. In real human terms, the Gulf relationship is not a geopolitical abstraction. It is the difference between a family in a village keeping the lights on or sitting in darkness. And right now, those workers are in countries that are themselves under Iranian drone attack. The Arab monarchies of the Gulf, the same governments that have provided a home and a livelihood to 10 million Indian citizens, are being targeted. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the most sought-after mediator in the world. Everyone wants you. Everyone needs you. Everyone is calling. And the moment you commit fully to any one of them, you lose the ability to serve any of the others. The moment India condemns Iran loudly enough to satisfy Washington fully, Tehran closes the corridor. The moment India publicly distances itself from the Israeli-American security architecture, Washington withdraws the waivers and the relationship capital built over 2 decades evaporates. The moment India loses either of those, its value as a mediator collapses entirely. So India walks the wire. Every day, every week, every phone call made and every vote cast at the United Nations is calibrated to millimeter precision. India is performing the most sophisticated diplomatic balancing act of any nation on earth right now. And it has to execute that performance perfectly in real time, under pressure, with the world watching, with its own economy under stress, with its own citizens at risk. But here is what also needs to be said. There is a genuine opportunity within all of this. India chairs BRICS right now, the grouping of major emerging economies that includes Russia and China, both of whom have strong reasons to want this conflict to end. The United Nations Secretary General has been calling for immediate diplomatic engagement. Iran, for all its defiant rhetoric, is governing a country in genuine distress. 3 million displaced, military command structures in disarray, oil infrastructure under attack. No country can sustain that indefinitely, not even one with decades of practice surviving under pressure. There is a deal to be made somewhere in the space between Tehran's grief and Washington's exhaustion. There is a ceasefire framework that someone needs to sketch out and someone needs to carry to all the parties simultaneously. India may be the only country on earth with an open phone line to all of them. Iran trusts India. Washington respects India. Russia and China, both pushing for de-escalation, are listening to India in its capacity as BRICS chair. The Gulf monarchies, desperate to stop the drone attacks raining down on their infrastructure, want someone with credibility to step in. India has something more valuable right now than a nuclear weapon or an aircraft carrier. India has a telephone that everyone picks up. That is rare. That is genuinely, historically rare. India is in a rare position right now, but it won't last forever. The chance to shape what happens next is limited. A ceasefire needs to be built, and someone has to bring all sides together. India is best placed to do it, not because it's neutral, but because it's trusted by everyone, even those who don't trust each other. But time is running out. The longer the conflict continues, the more India risks. Energy security, workers abroad, and key projects like Chabahar. India's smartest move now is to act. Step in, mediate, and push for a pause. It won't be perfect, but it could reduce damage, protect India's interests, and bring relief to millions. And it would prove that India's long-built trust is not just an idea. It works. History can be tough on countries in the short term, but in the long run it rewards those that make the right choices. India has mostly done that. Not perfectly and not without paying a price. Staying independent hasn't been easy. It meant facing criticism, pressure, and taking the harder path when easier options were available. But that choice has paid off. India has been able to act freely when others couldn't. It has helped even those it doesn't fully agree with and earn their respect. Major powers have turned to India during crises, and even opposing sides in conflicts have trusted it to step in. All of this is the result of years of patient, consistent decisions. India may not be directly part of every conflict, but it is still shaping what happens. And in the long run, that is one of the strongest positions a country can have,